Welcome to the Dark Chronicle. Tell us in the comments which country you're watching from and the time of day it is for you. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell to catch every chilling tale. They did not know their names when the price was first spoken aloud. Names did not matter. What mattered was the number. $3,500 in the 1840s American South, that some could buy land, horses, a fine house, or a man as freedom if the law allowed such a thing. But this money was not meant to build. It was meant to erase. It was posted for two people whose very existence had become an insult to the order of slavery, a man and a woman who had refused not only to submit but to vanish quietly. The first notice appeared on the courthouse door just before dawn. A square of thick paper, nailed hard into old wood, its edges still clean. By midday, a crowd had gathered, not enslaved people, who already understood what it meant, but white men who read the reward twice to be sure their eyes were not lying. Some laughed, shaking their heads, calling it exaggeration. Others said nothing at all, their faces tightening as they studied the crude sketches printed at the top. A broad-shouldered black man with watchful eyes, and beside him a woman, smaller but staring straight ahead, her jaw set like stone. Dead or alive, the notice read. Preferably alive. By sunset, copies were everywhere, on plantation gates, outside taverns, tacked to trees at crossroads. The number traveled faster than the paper. $3,500, enough to make a poor farmer bold, enough to make professional slave hunters sharpen their knives and ready their dogs. At first, the story sounded simple. Two runaways. Dangerous, yes, but not unheard of. They had fled together from neighboring plantations, taken advantage of a stormy night, and disappeared into the swamps where water swallowed tracks and snakes outnumbered men. The usual response followed: posses, bloodhounds, promises of leniency for informants, but days passed, then weeks, and instead of chains returning, only rumors did. A patrol sent into the Cypress Flats failed to come back. Their horses were found wandering, reins tangled in branches, eyes wild with fear. Another group returned shaken, swearing the dogs had gone silent all at once, as if something in the water had scared even them. An overseer from a nearby plantation vanished on his way home. His hat was found floating in a slow-moving creek, his body nowhere to be seen. That was when the whispers began to change shape. They said the couple did not run blindly. They said the man had learned the swamps as a child, memorized where water turned deep without warning, and where the ground looked solid but swallowed you whole. They said the woman had eyes sharp enough to read men the way others read weather, that she could tell when to hide and when to strike. They said the couple moved only at night, slept only where snakes could not reach, and left no fire smoke behind. The whispers were dismissed by plantation owners as nonsense, excuses for incompetence. But fear does not care what men in power believe. Fear spreads where proof lags behind, and proof came soon enough. One morning, a slave catcher named Harrow, known across 3 counties for never losing a trail, was found tied to a tree just beyond the swamp edge. His boots were gone, his rifle snapped in half beside him. He was alive, but only barely. When he finally spoke, days later, he refused to take another job involving the swamps, refused the money, refused to say what he had seen. He only kept repeating the same words over and over until his voice broke. They did run, he said. They watched. The bounty doubled in rumor if not on paper. $3,500 became $4, then $5. Tavern talk grew quieter when the subject came up. Men who had once bragged about hunting, runaways, now spoke in cautious tones, glancing at doors and windows as if the swamp itself might be listening. But no one yet spoke of legend, not openly. To understand how two people could bend the will of an entire region, one had to look back to the plantation where the story began, long before the swamp claimed them. He had been born into labor, into fields that stretched farther than hope. From boyhood, his back learned the language of the whip, his hands the rhythm of cotton and cane. He learned early that silence was survival. He watched men break themselves trying to run alone, watched women dragged back bleeding and broken. He learned patience, not because he wanted to, but because rage without timing was suicide. She lived a different hell. The big house, clean floors, polite smiles forced into place while violence wore silk gloves. What was taken from her could never be returned, only buried deep enough to keep breathing. She learned how to disappear while standing in plain sight, how to remember every insult without reacting, how to wait. They noticed each other not in romance but recognition. Two people who had learned the same lesson from different teachers, Endure, observe, survive. Their meetings were brief, stolen in shadows, never touching at first. Trust came slowly. Plans came slower. The first escape attempt was clumsy. Hope heavy. It failed before it truly began. Punishment followed, public, deliberate, meant to teach others what resistance earned. The man's back healed crooked. The woman was sent away for months, her return quieter, her eyes darker. Something changed then, not just in them but between them. The second attempt was not about freedom, it was about refusal. On a night thick with humidity, when thunder rolled far away and the swamp breathed like a living thing, they slipped their chains not with desperation but with intention. They took no food they could not replace, no blankets that would slow them. The man carried a tool stolen months earlier and hidden piece by piece. The woman carried nothing but knowledge, roots overheard, habits memorized, weaknesses catalogued. When the alarm came, it came late. Dogs followed. Men followed. And for the first time, the couple did not run until their lungs burned. They moved just far enough, just deep enough, then they stopped. The swamp took over. Water erased their tracks. Mud swallowed boots. Branches snapped under hunters who did not know where to step. When the first dog yelped and went quiet, the men laughed nervously. When the second vanished, laughter stopped. What happened next was not slaughter. It was instruction. The couple learned quickly. Learned how fear made men careless. Learned how greed narrowed vision. Learned how one scream in the dark could scatter 5 armed men. They did not attack for revenge at first. They attacked to survive, to remove pursuit, to create space. But space once claimed invites power. By the time the bounty posters appeared, the couple was no longer just escaping. They were shaping the hunt itself. They chose where the chase happened. They decided who went home and who did not. And somewhere between the swamp water and the blood-soaked mud, something else was born. A name. They did not call themselves anything, but others did, the death couple. And as part 1 closed, the South began to understand a terrible truth. These two were no longer running from slavery. Slavery was running from them. By the time the name settled into people's mouths, it no longer felt like a rumor. It felt like a warning passed quietly, the way storms were once announced by changes in the air rather than by sound. Men who had read the posters now pretended not to notice them. Others tore them down after dark, not out of mercy but superstition. There was a sense unspoken but shared that the paper itself invited something to watch you back. What no one understood yet was that the couple had not planned to become anything more than survivors. Legends are almost never born from ambition. They are born from pressure, from the narrowing of choices until only one shape remains. They moved deeper than before, into a stretch of swamp avoided even by locals. Cypress knees rose like broken teeth from black water. Mosquitoes swarmed so thick they formed a living veil. At night, the air smelled of rotten green life fighting for space. This was where the man had been brought once as a child to haul timber, where an older enslaved worker had whispered warnings and paths into his ear while overseers were too drunk to listen. Memory returned to him in fragments, the sound of frogs before rain, the way the water shifted color where it suddenly deepened, the trees whose roots hid solid ground beneath them. They did not speak much now. Words felt loud. Every decision was made through glances, through pauses held long enough to be understood. Hunger sharpened their senses. Exhaustion dulled fear and replaced it with something steadier, heavier. They were past the stage of panic. They were learning. On the third night after the bounty appeared, they watched a small group of hunters from across a narrow channel. 3 men, confident, joking too loudly, their dogs tugging at leashes. The couple stayed still for hours, letting insects crawl across their skin, letting cramps bloom and fade. When one of the men wandered off alone to relieve himself, the woman's hand tightened around the man's wrist. Not yet, her eyes said, not here. They waited until dawn, until the men grew tired and careless. When the group finally moved on, leaving behind a half-eaten ration and a dropped knife, the couple did not celebrate. They collected what was useful and melted back into the swamp. Survival was built from moments like this, not from blood. But blood came regardless. Days later, they encountered another patrol larger, more disciplined. The men moved cautiously, spacing themselves, checking ground ahead. These were not amateurs. The man recognized one face, an overseer known for breaking people who resisted, a man who enjoyed dreading things out. The woman. Breathing changed when she saw him. Not faster, slower, controlled. They tried to avoid contact, circled wide, but the swamp does not always offer clean exits. A misstep sent a ripple across still water. A dog's head snapped up. The chase was sudden and violent, sound tearing through the trees. They ran not blindly, but toward a place the man remembered as dangerous even for those who knew it. A stretch where the water lay calm and shallow until it abruptly vanished into a sinkhole hidden beneath decaying leaves. He splashed loudly just long enough to draw pursuit, then veered off at the last moment, pulling the woman into a thicket of roots. The first hunter hit the water running. He vanished with a shout that cut off too quickly. The second stopped short, skidding, scrambling backward in panic. In that moment the woman acted. She rose from cover, silent, and struck with the knife they had taken days earlier. It was fast, not clean, but final. They did not linger. They took what they could carry and disappeared as gunshots cracked wildly into trees. Later, when they were safe enough to breathe, the woman's hands shook. Not from fear, from release. The man watched her carefully, ready to steady her, but she did not break. She stared at her palms as if memorizing them anew. "This is what it is now," she said quietly, the first full sentence spoken in days. He nodded. There was no argument to make. From that point on, they changed how they moved. They stopped avoiding confrontation entirely and began shaping it. They left signs meant to confuse, sometimes to intimidate, a boot placed upright in mud, a snapped branch tied with cord, a dog collar hung from a tree. They wanted hunters to believe the swamp itself had turned against them. Fear made men sloppy. Sloppiness saved lives. But fear also attracted the worst kind of attention. Professional slave hunters arrived from farther counties, men who lived off bounties and cruelty. They brought better dogs, better weapons, and a hunger sharpened by reputation. These men did not laugh at rumors. They studied them, adjusted tactics. For the first time, the couple felt something close to being hunted by equals. The hunters tried to starve them out, blocking known exits, watching waterways. They set traps baited with food. They waited. Days stretched thin. Hunger became a constant ache, then a burning. The man began to weaken, his old injuries flaring. The woman took on more scouting, more risk. One night, she did not return on time. The man waited, counting breaths, forcing himself not to move. Every instinct screamed at him to search, to call her name, to break cover. Instead, he remembered what survival had already taught him. Panic killed faster than bullets. She returned just before dawn, soaked and bleeding from a shallow cut along her arm. She had lured a hunter away, she said, led him into deep water, but there were more. They were adapting. That night, the couple made a decision neither had wanted to name before. Running forever was no longer enough. As long as the bounty existed, as long as hunters believed the reward was real, they would never stop coming. The couple did not have the strength to fight an army, but they could change the cost. They began targeting leaders, the men who organized, who paid, who pushed others forward. An informant was found tied but alive, sent back with a message carved into wood rather than flesh. Stop. The message was ignored. Violence escalated, not in frequency, but in meaning. Each confrontation carried intent. Each survivor carried fear home like an infection. Plantation owners began hiring guards not to chase the couple but to protect themselves. Nights grew tense. Fires burned longer. Dogs barked at shadows. And still the couple did not revel in it. There was no joy in what they did, only necessity wrapped in resolve. In quiet moments, they spoke of before not to mourn, but to remember what they were fighting to preserve inside themselves, their humanity, their choice. The swamp, once a hiding place, became a kind of borderland. Inside it, the old rules bent. Inside it, two people who should have been erased had instead carved out something dangerous and undeniable, not freedom yet, not safety, but agency. By the end of that season, the posters had begun to fade, ink running with rain, edges curling. The number was still there, bold and tempting, but fewer men were willing to chase it. Too many had gone in confident and come out changed or not at all. And somewhere beneath the canopy of moss and shadow, the couple prepared for what they sensed was coming next. Not another patrol, not another bounty hunter, but an attempt to end the story altogether. They did not know when it would come. Only that it would be bigger, more desperate, and far more violent than anything before. The attempt came sooner than they expected, and it did not announce itself with trumpets or bravado. It arrived the way the most dangerous things always did, quietly, wrapped in confidence, disguised as order. For days the swamp had felt wrong, too still. The frogs that usually sang at dusk fell silent early. Birds lifted suddenly from trees for no visible reason. Even the insects seemed to thin, as if the land itself were holding its breath. The man noticed it first, then the woman. They did not speak about it, but they adjusted without discussion, moving camps twice in one night, doubling back on their own trails, resting only in places where escape ran in more than one direction. Then they smelled smoke. Not the careless smoke of hunters cooking meat, but thin, deliberate lines rising from multiple points, spaced too evenly. Someone was burning the swamp in pieces, forcing movement, driving whatever lived inside toward a chosen path. It was a tactic used in war, not in slave catching. And it told them exactly what kind of men were coming. By nightfall they heard voices, many of them low, controlled, orders given and followed. No shouting, no laughter. This was not a posse fueled by greed alone. This was coordination, paid for by plantation owners who had grown tired of fear, who wanted the story finished so normal life could resume. The woman pressed her palm against the man's chest, feeling his heartbeat steady but heavy. This is it, her eyes said. Not the end, but the test. They moved ahead of the smoke, slipping through water that burned their skin where ash had settled, pushing into a stretch of swamp they had avoided until now. It was dangerous, even for them. Narrow ridges of solid ground surrounded by deep, slow-moving water, tangled with roots that could trip you into drowning if you panicked. But danger was relative. What killed the careless could shelter the careful. By dawn, they found evidence of just how large the force was. Boot prints layered over one another. Broken branches cut clean, not snapped. Dogs, many dogs. The man counted at least 20 sets of tracks, maybe more. Armed men moved in arcs, tightening, confident they could not be outmaneuvered forever. The couple did not try to outrun them. They could not. Instead, they did what the swamp had taught them best. They disappeared in plain sight. They submerged themselves in water up to their chins, breathing through hollow reeds the man had prepared weeks earlier for this exact moment. Leeches clung to their skin. The woman's arm burned where her wound reopened, but she did not flinch. They stayed like that for hours while men passed close enough that muddy water rippled with each step. A dog stopped near them once, sniffing, whining softly. The handler tugged the leash, impatient, and moved on. When night fell again, the couple resurfaced behind the advancing line, soaked, shaking, but alive. The man pointed out a narrow channel that curved back toward the heart of the swamp. Not an escape route, a funnel. They began to leave signs again, more deliberately than before. Broken branches arranged like careless mistakes, a scrap of cloth caught on thorns. Footprints that led forward, then vanished. They wanted the hunters to believe they were tiring, slipping, losing discipline. It worked. The hunters pushed harder, spreading thinner to cover ground faster. Orders grew sharper. Tension cracked the edges of control. A single mistake was all the swamp ever needed. The first body was found at dawn. One of the outer men, separated from the group, caught in a snare the man had fashioned from wire and patience. He had not died quickly. His screams had carried, but by the time others arrived, there was only blood in the water and the echo of fear in their own chests. The response was immediate and brutal. Gunfire tore into trees. Dogs were unleashed without restraint. Fire spread faster, smoke thickening the air until it was hard to breathe. The woman grabbed the man's face, forcing him to look at her. Not fear. Resolve. We keep moving, her eyes said. We finish what they started. They struck again that night, not head-on, but from the edges. A dog handler pulled underwater so quietly that his leash drifted empty before anyone noticed. A man shot in the leg, left screaming, drawing others away while the couple slipped past the main group. Each move was calculated, costly, exhausting. By the third day, the hunters were no longer advancing in neat lines. They were reacting, jumping at sounds, firing into shadows, turning on one another with suspicion. The man overheard an argument near a fire, accusations of cowardice, of being cursed, of walking into something that was no longer just a job. That word surfaced again. Cursed. The couple used it without ever saying it aloud. They let superstition do some of the work for them. They left marks that looked intentional but meant nothing. Arranged bones, symbols scratched into bark that had no true meaning, only menace. Fear does not require truth. It only requires imagination. Still, numbers mattered. For every hunter they slowed or removed, more remained. And exhaustion crept in like cold water, numbing judgment. The man's leg began to fail him. The woman's wound worsened. They could not keep this pace forever. The turning point came near the river, crossing the same place where traders once moved goods and people alike. the same place the couple had crossed months earlier while running, never imagining they would return. The hunters had guessed they might try for it again. They masked their confidence, blocking what they believed was the final exit. The couple approached from downstream, watching torches flicker through fog. There were too many men to slip past cleanly. Too many guns. The man looked at the woman, searching her face for hesitation. There was none. They did not aim to escape the crossing, they aimed to break it. Upstream they had worked earlier that night, loosening earth, weakening roots, redirecting water into channels the hunters could not see in the dark. Now, as the hunters advanced into position, the couple struck the first torch with a thrown stone wrapped in cloth. Flame leapt. Smoke billowed. Confusion rippled outward. Gunshots rang. Orders collided. In the chaos, water surged where it should not have, ground gave way beneath boots, men stumbled into currents stronger than expected. The river became a trap. The man and woman moved like shadows along the edges, striking only when needed, vanishing again. They were no longer fighting for escape alone, they were dismantling the certainty that these men had carried with them into the swamp. By dawn, the crossing was a wreck. Bodies lay where water had deposited them, equipment floated uselessly, survivors dragged themselves out coughing, wounded, shaken beyond words. And the couple was gone, not seen retreating north. Not east or west, simply gone, as if the swamp had closed around them and swallowed the story whole. In the days that followed, officials argued about what to report. Plantation owners demanded proof: heads, chains, bodies. None could be produced with confidence. Witnesses contradicted each other. Some swore the couple had died in the water. Others insisted they had seen two figures watching from the trees as the survivors fled. The bounty remained posted, but the energy behind it had changed. It no longer promised easy money. It promised risk, humiliation, and a very real chance of never returning home. And somewhere beyond the reach of smoke and shouting, the man and woman rested for the first time in weeks, not in safety but in silence. They knew the hunt was not truly over, but they also knew something else now. Something the swamp had carved into them as surely as scars. They had crossed a line from which there was no return, and the people hunting them knew it too. Silence followed them like a living thing. After the river crossing, after the smoke and the bodies and the shattered certainty of the men who had come to end them, the swamp seemed to exhale. The birds returned cautiously. Frogs began to sing again at dusk, tentative at first, then louder, as if testing whether the danger had truly passed. The couple listened to those sounds the way others listened to church bells or warnings shouted from roads. Life returning meant they were still alive too. They did not celebrate. They did not speak of victory. What they had done carried weight, and weight demanded stillness. For several days they barely moved, hiding in a pocket of higher ground surrounded by water so dark it reflected nothing. They ate sparingly fish caught by hand, roots the man remembered from childhood, leaves the woman had learned to identify from an older cook long ago. They cleaned wounds. They rested muscles that trembled when they stopped using them. Sleep came in short, careful bursts, each of them taking turns staying half awake, listening. Word of the river spread faster than either of them expected. They did not hear it directly, but they felt it in absence. No new patrols entered the swamp. No distant gunshots cracked the night. No smoke rose in neat lines. The hunters who survived carried stories back with them, and those stories were doing what the couple, as knives could not, stopping men before they ever stepped into the water. But fear has a way of hardening into resolve, especially among those who believe their authority has been changed. The plantation owners did not sleep easier knowing two enslaved people had made fools of armed white men. If anything, the humiliation cut deeper than loss. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Letters were written. Money changed hands again. The next wave would not be improvised. The couple sensed the shift before they saw it. One night, the man returned from scouting with his face set hard, jaw clenched in a way the woman recognized immediately. They were not coming like before, he said quietly. They were bringing the land with them. She understood at once. This was not about chasing anymore. This was about erasure. The strategy revealed itself slowly. Fields at the edge of the swamp were cleared aggressively, trees felled, undergrowth burned. Paths were cut where none had existed, not to move men quickly but to remove cover. The swamp was being wounded, carved open so that hiding became harder with each passing day. It was a war not just against two people, but against the place that had protected them. For the first time since they fled, the woman felt something close to despair. Not fear of death, she had made peace with that long ago, but grief. The swamp had become more than shelter. It had become proof that the world could bend enough to let them exist. Watching it be destroyed felt personal, intimate, like losing a language. They argued for the first time since the river. "We can't stay," she said. "They'll starve us out if they have to." "And where do we go?" he replied. "Every road leads back to chains." The silence after that was heavy, filled with truths neither wanted to say aloud. Running north was a dream others spoke of, not a guarantee. West was unknown. Staying meant becoming ghosts in a shrinking world. The decision came not from logic, but from memory. The man remembered an old route traders once used before railroads, a path that cut through the swamp, as edge, and into rough country where authority thinned and maps lied. It was dangerous, long, but it offered something the swamp no longer could: movement. They began preparing quietly, not packing. There was nothing to pack but shedding. Anything that slowed them, anything that tied them to this place more than necessity already had. They cached tools they might retrieve later, marked trees in ways only they would recognize. They were not abandoning the swamp entirely. They were leaving a door open. The night they set out, they noticed something else. They were being watched. Not by hunters, by enslaved people from nearby plantations who had begun slipping into the edges of the swamp after dark. At first, they stayed hidden, observing. Then one woman approached alone, hands empty, eyes lowered in a gesture of peace. "We heard you," she whispered. "We heard what you did." The couple exchanged a look. This was the consequence they had not planned for, the ripple that could not be controlled. Hope was a dangerous thing. It drew people into risk. They spoke for hours that night, voices low. The woman told them of punishments growing harsher, of patrols tightening, of fear moving down the quarters like sickness. Some wanted to run. Others just wanted proof that resistance did not always end in a noose. The man felt the weight of every word. He had never wanted to be an example. Examples got killed. But he could not deny what they had become in the eyes of others. Before dawn, they made a choice harder than any fight. They taught, not everything, not enough to turn the swamp into a battlefield again, but enough. How to read tracks, how to move without leaving signs, how to listen for danger before it arrived. They warned them to warn them that survival was not heroic, that it was lonely, that it cost pieces of you that never grew back. Some listened. Some did tea, that was beyond their control. When the couple finally left the swamp, heart, they did so knowing they were not leaving emptiness behind. The land would remember them, and so would the people. The new terrain tested them immediately. Dry ground meant clear tracks. Hills meant exposure. Roads meant witnesses. They moved mostly at night, skirting settlements, stealing moments of rest wherever darkness pulled deep enough to hide them. They were weaker now, leaner, worn down by weeks of constant decision-making. But they were also sharper. The fear that once threatened to overwhelm them had settled into something like clarity. They trusted each other without question. If one stopped, the other stopped. If one turned, the other followed. Still, the world beyond the swamp was less forgiving. They encountered a patrol not far from an abandoned mill, smaller than those before but alert. There was no room for traps, no water to swallow mistakes. The fight was fast, brutal, and close. The man took a blow that left his vision swimming. The woman dragged him into brush, cutting down one hunter who came too close, then another. When it ended, they were both shaking, breath ragged, hands slick with blood. They did not look back at the bodies. That night, as they hid beneath a rock overhang, the woman finally let herself speak what had been pressing on her since the river. "They want to stop," she said. "Not because of the money, because of what we are to them now." He nodded. "A reminder. A threat," she corrected. Outside, wind moved through tall grass, carrying distant sounds of life continuing as if nothing had changed. Farms, roads, homes built on suffering so normalized it no longer needed explanation. They did not know then how their story would end, whether they would die violently, vanish quietly, or live long enough to become something even harder to kill than bodies, memory. But as they lay there bruised and breathing, one truth was undeniable. The hunt had transformed. It was no longer about capturing two escaped enslaved people. It was about extinguishing an idea that had already spread too far to be contained. And the death couple, whether they wanted the name or not, were walking proof that the world the hunters defended was far more fragile than it pretended to be. By the time winter began to creep into the low country, the story no longer belonged to the land where it had been born. It traveled ahead of them now, carried by frightened mouths and exaggerated retellings, reshaped each time it crossed a road or passed through a tavern. In some versions, the couple was already dead, their bodies weighted and sunk in the river. In others, they had crossed into free territory, leaving a trail of blood behind them like a warning. And in the most dangerous versions, the ones whispered late at night, they were no longer just two people at all, but something else, something that could not be caught because it did not obey the rules of flesh. The couple heard fragments of these stories when they dared to move close enough to civilization to steal food or gather information. A farmer muttering to his wife, a drunk man arguing with shadows, a preacher thundering about divine punishment for disorder. Every version stripped pieces of truth away and replaced them with fear. The woman understood this instinctively. When people could not explain something, they turned it into a monster so they would not have to question themselves. But monsters attracted hunters of a different kind. The men who came next did not chase bounties for money alone. They chased reputations. Some had lost family at the river. Others had lost status, their authority mocked by the idea that two enslaved people had humiliated them. These men did not rush, they planned. They watched patterns. They looked to the weakest link, not in the swamp or the terrain, but among people. That was how betrayal entered the story, not as a single dramatic moment, but as a slow tightening. It began with rumors of informants. Enslaved people questioned too closely. Rewards offered quietly for information, not in posters but in promises, protection, lighter work, a delay of punishment. Fear is a weapon more reliable than greed, and it was used carefully. The couple noticed signs almost too late, a food cache disturbed but not taken, tracks that vanished too neatly, a night when the wind carried voices that did not belong. They argued again, more sharply this time, each accusing the other of missing something obvious. Exhaustion made their words harsher than they meant. When the argument ended, they sat apart in silence, the distance between them heavier than any physical wound. The trap, when it came, was clever. They were moving through a stretch of woodland that bordered several small plantations, a place they had crossed before without trouble. The night was quiet, too quiet. The man felt it first, a pressure behind the eyes, the sense of being observed from multiple directions. He reached for the woman, as hand, but the moment stretched too long. Gunfire erupted from the dark. They ran instinctively, splitting as they had learned never to do, each veering toward cover. The man felt fire explode through his side as a bullet grazed him. He stumbled, fell, forced himself up again. The woman disappeared into brush to his left. Shouts followed, dogs, torches flared to life, hemming the darkness in. The hunters moved with grim patience, not charging, not wasting ammunition. They knew time was on their side. The man reached a shallow ravine and slid into it, pressing himself against cold earth, breathing shallow and slow. Blood soaked his shirt, warm at first, then chilling. He listened for the woman. As footsteps, her signal, anything.
Nothing.
Minutes dragged into hours. At some point he heard a woman scream, not her voice. He realized with horror, but close enough to tear something loose inside his chest. A trick. A lure. He bit down hard enough to taste blood, forcing himself not to move. When dawn broke, pale and unforgiving, the forest looked ordinary again. Too ordinary. The hunters withdrew, confident they had what they came for. The man waited until his muscles shook from the effort of staying still. Then he crawled out of the ravine, every movement agony, calling her name once, quietly, knowing it was already too late. He found signs of a struggle. Broken branches, drag marks. A scrap of cloth he recognized instantly, clutched in his fist until his vision blurred. There were no bodies, no blood trail he could follow without exposing himself. By noon, word reached nearby towns that one half of the death couple had been captured. The woman, alive. The announcement was deliberate, public, designed to break what remained. They said she would be displayed, questioned, made an example of. They said the other one would come running if there was anything human left in him. The man hid for 2 days, feverish, drifting in and out of consciousness, wrestling with a decision that tore at him from every angle. He knew what traps looked like now. He knew they wanted him to come, but he also knew what awaited her if he did nothing. On the third night, he moved. He did not go to rescue her in the way stories would later claim. There was no heroic charge, no sudden ambush. He followed quietly, painfully, using every scrap of knowledge he had gathered over months of running. He learned where she was held from overheard conversations, from a guard who drank too much and talked too freely about how the woman did. Tea break like they thought she would. That detail mattered. The place was not a jail, but a plantation house turned temporary holding ground, guarded lightly because arrogance had returned. They believed the legend was ending. They believed they were in control again. The man waited until rain came, heavy and loud enough to blur sound and vision. He slipped into the house through a rear entrance he had once cleaned as a boy, memory guiding him where maps could not. He moved past sleeping guards, past a man praying drunkenly over his own courage. He found her in a storage room, wrists bound, face bruised but eyes sharp when she saw him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no time for relief, only urgency. The escape was chaos. A guard woke too soon. A shot rang out. Someone screamed. The couple ran into the rain, bullets tearing into darkness, dogs barking as doors slammed open behind them. They did not make it far before the woman stumbled. Her strength had been drained deliberately. The man half carried her, half dragged her through mud and water, driven by something beyond thought. When they finally reached cover deep enough to hide, she collapsed against him, breath shallow, trembling. They stayed hidden for days, barely moving, barely eating. Infection set in. The woman burned with fever. The man whispered to her constantly, stories, memories, anything to anchor her to this world. Sometimes she responded. Sometimes she did not. In one of her clearer moments, she gripped his hand with surprising strength. "If I don't make it," she said, voice thin but steady, "don't let them tell it." He shook his head, unable to speak. "Don't let them decide how this ends." She survived that night and the next, but she did not fully recover. The injuries she carried went deeper than bone. Movement became slower. Pain constant. They knew then that the path they had been walking together was narrowing. Not because the hunt had succeeded, but because bodies had limits legends did not. The bounty posters disappeared soon after, not torn down, not revoked, just quietly removed. Officials claimed the threat was over, that justice had been done. That order had been restored, but no proof was ever shown. No public execution, no bodies displayed long enough to satisfy the rumors. Some said the woman died in the woods, and the man followed soon after. Others insisted they saw two figures months later, moving west, limping but alive. In secret gatherings, enslaved people whispered that the death couple had chosen to vanish rather than be claimed, turning themselves into a story no one could cage. What was certain was this: the hunters never got their certainty back. They won something, perhaps, control, for a time, but they lost the ability to believe fully in it. Every shadow held memory now. Every quiet place carried the echo of resistance. And somewhere, whether in flesh or only in the telling, the death couple endured not as monsters, not as myths, but as proof that even in a world built to crush defiance, two people had forced it to bend. And bending once done could never be undone. Time did what hunters could not. It blurred the edges. Seasons turned. Crops rose and fell. New overseers took old men's places. Children were born who would never hear the original gunshots at the river, or smell the smoke that once crept across the swamp. On paper, order returned. On ledgers, losses were written off. The bounty became an embarrassment no one wished to explain. And yet, beneath the surface of everyday life, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. The couple did not vanish in a single moment. They thinned like mist at sunrise, visible one second, gone the next, but leaving dampness behind that proved it had been there. Those who claimed certainty about their end were the ones who knew the least. There were no bodies shown long enough to quiet the questions. No public proof sturdy enough to withstand time. The man and woman themselves understood that survival now meant something different. Running together, as they once had, was no longer possible. Her body carried too much damage. His wounds healed badly, reopening when he pushed too hard. Every step risked exposure, not just to hunters, but to illness, to accident, to the slow betrayals of a body worn past its limits. They moved less, waited more. They learned to let days pass without action, something that had once felt like surrender but now felt like strategy. They avoided confrontation entirely, even when instinct urged otherwise. They were no longer shaping the hunt. They were letting it starve. In hidden places, an abandoned outbuilding, a cave known only to those who hauled stone long ago, a cluster of trees whose roots formed a hollow, they rested and watched the world move around them. Sometimes they caught glimpses of it through stolen words. A patrol reassigned. A road deemed unlucky. A plantation owner who slept with a pistol beneath his pillow long after the threat was supposed to be gone. The woman spoke less, conserving breath, but when she did, her words were precise. "They were pretending it's over," she said once, staring at a horizon she could barely see. "That's how they survive it." The man nodded. He had noticed the same thing. Silence was being used as erasure. If no one talked about what happened, then it could be folded neatly into the past, stripped of its meaning, taught incorrectly or not at all. That was the danger now, not capture, but distortion. They made one final decision together, slowly, with care. Not about escape routes or ambushes, but about memory. They could not control how their story would be told by those who hunted them, but they could influence how it lived among those who needed it. They did not announce themselves. They did not gather crowds. That would have invited disaster. Instead, they spoke in fragments, to individuals when the risk was worth it. An enslaved man hauling timber at dawn. A woman sent to fetch water at night. A boy old enough to listen but young enough to remember. They never claimed heroism, never encouraged recklessness. They told the truth as they lived it. Fear was constant, freedom uncertain, survival costly. But they also told them what they had learned, that knowledge mattered, that the land itself could be read like scripture, that obedience was not the same thing as safety. In this way, the death couple stopped being only two people. They became a lesson passed hand to hand, mouth to ear, altered, softened, hardened, depending on who carried it. In some tellings, the woman died and the man walked on alone. In others, they crossed a border and lived quietly until old age. In still others, they never existed at all, only the idea of them, born from fear and hope colliding. Authorities did what they always did when faced with stories they could not fully suppress. They reshaped them. Newspapers printed small notices claiming the fugitives had been dealt with. Preachers spoke of divine justice without naming names. Records were lost, misplaced, or never written at all. But absence is not the same as erasure. Years later, hunters still avoided certain swamps. Dogs refused to cross certain waters. Men who laughed at old tales found their voices dropping when they spoke of those places, as if the land itself had ears. Children grew up hearing warnings that made no sense on the surface. Don't go there after dark. Don't trust easy money. Don't believe that chains are as strong as they look. The woman did not live long, that much the man knew with a quiet certainty he did not share aloud. Her body had been pushed too far, asked to endure too much. When she died, it was not in a blaze of violence, but in stillness, her hand in his, her breathing slowing like a tide going out. He buried her where no marker would draw attention, using stones that would blend back into the land with time. He stayed longer than he should have, grieved in silence, learned what it meant to be alone without being broken. After that, his path faded further into uncertainty. Some said he headed west. Others believed he turned back south under a different name. There were those who swore they saw an older black man years later, limping slightly, helping others navigate dangerous ground, disappearing before dawn. Whether any of that was true no longer mattered as much as it once had. What mattered was what remained. The idea that two people, denied everything, had refused to be erased quietly, that they had forced a system built on certainty to reveal its cracks, that the hunt, once unquestioned, had become something men hesitated to join, something that carried consequences beyond blood and money. The death couple did not end slavery. They did not overthrow the world that tried to destroy them. They did something smaller and, in some ways, more dangerous. They proved that fear could change sides. Long after the bounty was forgotten, long after the posters rotted into pulp, the story continued to surface where it was least expected. In songs hummed under breath, in warnings given to children, in the way people looked at swamps, at forest, at any place where control weakened and the land still remembered who had walked it. History would not give them monuments. It would not carve their names into stone. That was not how such stories survived. They survived because, once heard, they could not be unheard. And somewhere between truth and legend, between flesh and memory, the death couple lived on, not as ghosts, not as myths, but as a reminder that even in the darkest chapters, resistance did not always roar. Sometimes it endured. And endurance, when witnessed, changed everything.